In the quiet residential neighborhood of Westport, Connecticut, Mary Harrison lived with her husband David and their 10-year-old daughter Emily. Mary was a nurse at the local general hospital, trusted by both her colleagues and patients. Her husband David was a certified public accountant and was known throughout the town as a devoted, education-focused father. Neighbors would often say, "David Harrison is such a wonderful father." Mary deeply respected her husband's educational approach. David took Emily's future seriously, creating detailed daily study schedules and carefully checking her homework. Thanks to this, Emily's grades consistently remained at the top of her class, and Mary was proud of her daughter's excellence. Whenever David said, "Emily has unlimited potential. It's our responsibility as parents to build a solid foundation for her now," Mary was moved by her husband's devoted love. David's parents, the Roberts, were even more strict and had higher educational expectations than their son. Robert, a former high school principal, and Patricia, a former music teacher, held very high standards for their granddaughter Emily as well. Every Sunday during family dinners, Grandfather Robert would carefully review Emily's report card and nod with satisfaction, saying, "I'm proud to have such an excellent granddaughter." Grandmother Patricia would also beam, saying, "Emily is such a smart child. She'll surely become a fine woman in the future." Mary was busy balancing work and home life, leaving Emily's education entirely to David. When she came home exhausted after night shifts, she often saw David helping Emily with her homework. Each time David would smile and report, "Welcome home, Mary. Emily worked hard studying again today." Mary's heart would fill with gratitude toward her husband. Recently, Mary had been concerned that Emily seemed less energetic than before. Her daughter still achieved excellent grades, but she smiled less and sometimes showed a distant expression. When Mary discussed this with David, he smiled gently and replied, "She's 10 now. It's part of growing up. Children sometimes become more introverted during growth periods. You don't need to worry too much." David's words seemed accurate, and Mary felt reassured. Emily was indeed growing up. The daughter who had once been active and talkative now spent more time quietly reading books or drawing alone. Mary was pleased with her daughter's intellectual growth, but sometimes the shadow-like expression in Emily's eyes concerned her. However, whenever David explained, children develop complex emotions as they grow. That's natural too, Mary's anxiety would ease. The Harrison family's daily routine flowed peacefully and regularly. In the mornings, David would have breakfast with Emily and help her prepare for school. Since Mary often worked night shifts, she was grateful that she could leave the busy morning routine to her husband. When Emily returned from school, David would prepare snacks and help with homework. At dinner, the family of 3 would discuss the day's events, and on weekends they would visit the grandparents for family time. Neighbors often described them as an ideal family, and Mary was genuinely satisfied. Her husband was loving and education-focused, her daughter was excellent and growing up well-behaved. She had fulfilling work and could return to a warm home. For Mary, there was nothing more she could wish for. One evening after dinner, after Emily had gone to her room to do homework as usual, Mary sincerely told David, "You're truly a wonderful father." David smiled gently and replied, "I'd do anything for my family. My greatest wish is for Emily to grow up happy." David's expression at that moment was full of deep love, and Mary felt grateful once again for having married such a good husband. Emily's day began at 6 in the morning with David's voice. "Good morning, Emily. Let's do our best today," her father's gentle voice would echo in her room. David's study schedule was managed down to the minute, 30 minutes before breakfast for reviewing the previous day's work, reading time after breakfast, and homework and preparation waiting after returning from school. Mary admired her husband's methodical nature, but sometimes she was concerned about Emily's tense expressions. At school, Emily was an exemplary student. During parent-teacher conferences, Mrs. Anderson praised her, saying, "Emily is truly excellent and serves as a model for the class." However, she also added with concern, "She sometimes seems tired lately." Is everything all right? When Mary told David about this, her husband calmly explained, she's a motivated child, so she sets high goals for herself. That's also evidence of her growth. Mary was also somewhat concerned about Emily's friendships. Previously, Emily often played with friends after school, but recently she had been declining invitations, saying, I have studying to do that, I promised Dad. When Jennifer's mother, a neighbor with a daughter the same age, approached Mary saying, I'd like to invite Emily to play, but she always seems busy, Mary felt apologetic. When she consulted David, he said, this is the most important time. Playing with friends is important too, but developing study habits will be more beneficial for her future, and Mary followed her husband's judgment. Daily study time at home was set at 3 hours. David would sit beside Emily and carefully check each homework assignment. Let's try this calculation one more time, or, the stroke order for this character is wrong. Mary respected her husband's passion for education as she watched him gently guide their daughter. However, she was concerned when Emily sometimes sighed quietly or showed relief the moment David left his seat. Mary's work schedule was irregular, with both night shifts and early morning shifts. Therefore, David managed most of Emily's daily routine. When Mary came home exhausted from work, housework and homework guidance were often perfectly completed, filling her with gratitude toward her husband. When Mary said, thank you so much. Without you, I couldn't balance work and child rearing, David would reply, it's natural because we're family. Because you work so hard, I can properly take care of Emily. The expectations from David's parents, the Roberts, sometimes became pressure from Mary as well. During Sunday family dinners, Grandfather Robert would ask detailed questions about Emily's grades, and Grandmother Patricia would say, unlike our era, children today really have it tough, while not hiding her expectations for her granddaughter. When her mother-in-law said, I want Emily to become a doctor or lawyer in the future, Mary sometimes felt these expectations might be too heavy for her daughter. But seeing David respond, we will provide solid education so she can meet our parents' expectations, Mary felt reassured by her husband's sense of responsibility. One evening, when Mary came home early, she heard David and Emily's voices as they studied. However, something seemed different from usual. David's voice sounded stricter than normal, and Emily's responses seemed small and trembling. When Mary entered the living room, they had returned to their normal study scene. Welcome home, David greeted her with a smile, but Mary was concerned that Emily's eyes looked slightly red. When she asked, what's wrong, Emily? Her daughter replied, nothing. I'm just a little tired. Since David explained, we were working on a difficult problem, so she concentrated a bit too hard, Mary felt reassured. Emily had recently begun showing signs of being unusually frightened of her father. When David entered the room, Emily's body would stiffen slightly. Even when having her homework checked, she no longer seemed as happy as before, approaching it with a tense expression. When Mary consulted her husband about this change, David explained, this is common for children before entering adolescence. They become nervous because they respect their father so much. I think it's actually a good tendency. Mary was convinced by her husband's words and found it endearing that her daughter deeply respected her father. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Mary would wake to hear small crying sounds from Emily's room. Rushing to her daughter's room, she would find Emily crying, saying she had a bad dream. When Mary hugged and comforted her, her daughter would anxiously murmur, Mom, I need to work harder, don't I? When Mary replied, why? Emily, you're already working hard enough, her daughter would answer in a small voice, Dad said so. That it's still not enough. Mary became worried that her husband's high expectations might be putting pressure on their daughter, but when she consulted David the next morning, he promised, children sometimes take adults' words too seriously. I'll make sure to properly convey that my words come from love. Even mealtimes began to carry a different tension than before. Emily would sit properly and quietly listen to David's conversation, but her expression seemed to have lost the innocence typical of a 10-year-old child. When Mary asked, "Did anything fun happen at school today?" Emily would often glance at her father's face before answering, "Nothing in particular." David would smile, saying, "She's at the age when children become shy," but Mary felt confused by her daughter's changes. Still, on the surface, their ideal family was maintained. Neighbors continued to praise them, saying, "The Harrison family is wonderful," and Emily's teachers continued to recognize her excellence. Mary continued to warmly watch over her husband and daughter's relationship, hoping that her worries were unfounded. One October morning, Emily groaned softly while pressing her left cheek during breakfast. Mary rushed to her daughter's side and asked worriedly, "What's wrong, Emily?" Emily answered in a small voice with tears in her eyes, "My tooth hurts." Mary gently stroked her daughter's cheek and consulted with David, "We need to take her to the dentist." David was calm as usual and said, "Right. But if the pain isn't severe, we could wait until after today's study schedule," but seeing Emily's pained expression, he changed his mind. "Actually, we should probably have her examined sooner," he said gently, patting his daughter's head. Mary immediately called Dr. Johnson's dental clinic, which had a good reputation in the neighborhood, and was able to get a 2 p.m. appointment. "Will work be okay for you?" David asked Mary. Since Mary had an afternoon shift that day, she replied, "I'll be fine as long as I get to the hospital by 3. Then David said something unexpected, "I'll come with you too." Mary looked at her husband in surprise. David had never taken time off work during weekday afternoons to accompany them to medical appointments. "But what about your work?" Mary asked with concern, and David replied, "I'll try to reschedule my afternoon meeting. I'm worried about Emily too." Mary was moved by her husband's deep love for their family and smiled, saying, "Thank you. Emily will feel more secure with Dad there too." However, Emily's reaction was unexpected. Her daughter's expression stiffened for a moment, and she murmured anxiously, "Dad's coming too? What's wrong? Don't you want Dad to come?" Mary asked gently, and Emily hurriedly shook her head. "That's not it. I'd be happy if Dad comes," she said, but her voice clearly contained tension. David placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder and said gently, "It's okay, Emily. Dad will be there with you, so don't worry," but Mary didn't miss the fact that Emily's body was trembling slightly. At 2 p.m., the three Harrisons were in Dr. Johnson's dental clinic waiting room. The waiting room was clean and bright, with children's books and magazines available. However, Emily didn't read any books and just sat quietly with her hands clenched on her lap. David sat beside his daughter, occasionally saying, "It's okay," but Emily's tension didn't ease at all. When a nurse called Emily Harrison, Emily tried to stand up but stumbled. When Mary quickly supported her, she noticed her daughter's hands were cold and damp. "You don't need to be so nervous. It's just a dental examination," Mary comforted her, but Emily's face had turned pale. Upon entering the examination room, Dr. Johnson greeted them with a warm smile. He was a gentle physician in his late 50s, and it was immediately clear he was experienced with child patients. "Hello, Emily. Where does it hurt?" he asked kindly while adjusting the examination chair for the patient. Emily answered in a small voice, "My left back tooth hurts." Dr. Johnson said, "Dad and Mom are here with you, so don't worry," as he began preparing for the examination. However, at that moment, the doctor's gaze turned toward David, and for an instant, his expression became sharp as if he were studying something. Mary didn't notice this change, but David sensed the physician's gaze and displayed an unnatural smile. "Now, can you open your mouth wide for me?" Dr. Johnson asked Emily. Emily obediently opened her mouth, but then something abnormal happened. Her daughter's body began to tremble slightly. Mary thought, she must be nervous, but she noticed that Dr. Johnson's expression became even more serious. During the examination, Dr. Johnson repeatedly turned back to look at David with sharp glances. David politely asked, "Doctor, how is my daughter's dental condition?" but the physician's response was brief and somehow cold. There are no cavities, but let me examine more carefully, the doctor replied, continuing to examine the mouth with even greater care. Emily's trembling didn't stop, and she curled up small on the examination chair. Mary held her daughter's hand and encouraged her, "It's okay, it'll be over soon," but Emily wouldn't look in David's direction. Dr. Johnson continued the examination while occasionally sighing deeply. "The cause of the pain appears to be teeth grinding due to stress," Dr. Johnson finally announced his diagnosis. "Particularly severe nighttime teeth grinding seems to be putting strain on the teeth." Mary was surprised and said, "Teeth grinding? But I've never heard such sounds." The doctor explained, "Grinding doesn't always make noise. Sometimes people unconsciously clench their teeth." David questioned, "You mentioned stress as the cause, but I don't think Emily has that much stress." At that moment, Dr. Johnson's gaze turned toward David, and this time his expression clearly contained hostility. "The causes of stress in children vary," the physician replied coldly, continuing to write something in the chart. When the examination ended and Emily was getting down from the chair, her legs were still trembling. Dr. Johnson said, "Let's observe the situation for a while, and please come back if the pain continues," but these words were directed at Mary, and he didn't even look at David. While settling the bill at the reception desk, Mary was thinking about the physician's strange behavior. Why had Dr. Johnson looked at David with such glaring eyes? David also seemed somewhat displeased, muttering quietly, "That doctor was strange." Emily walked between her parents, still looking tense. As they were leaving, when Mary was putting on her coat, Dr. Johnson appeared from the reception area. "Ma'am, I'd like to have a word," he began, but noticing David was nearby, he stopped speaking. Instead, the physician naturally approached Mary's side and said, "Take care," while slipping something into her coat pocket. Mary didn't understand what had happened for a moment, but she felt Dr. Johnson giving her a meaningful look. The physician said, "If you have any concerns about Emily, please don't hesitate to call me anytime," and returned to the reception desk. In the car, David said with displeasure, "That doctor was unpleasant. We should probably find another dental clinic." Emily sat quietly in the back seat, and Mary was worried about her daughter's condition. She had noticed something was in her coat pocket but couldn't check it with David present. When they arrived home, David said, "I need to get back to work," and hurried out. While preparing for her hospital shift, Mary asked Emily, "How's your tooth pain?" Her daughter replied, "A little better," but still looked anxious. In the car on her way to the hospital, Mary finally checked what was in her coat pocket. There was a small folded piece of paper with a brief message written in careful handwriting. The moment Mary read it, the blood drained from her face. "I'm concerned about your daughter. Please call me when you're alone. There are things I need to discuss with you about what I observed today. Dr. Johnson." Mary's hands began to shake. What had the physician discovered? Why had he been so hostile toward David? Various questions raced through her mind. Mary pulled over to the roadside and took out her cell phone with trembling hands, dialing the police number. However, Mary didn't know specifically what to report and ended up hanging up. Reading Dr. Johnson's message over and over with shaking hands, Mary was confused. What was happening to her daughter? What had David done? Mary's mind was swirling with nothing but questions. She couldn't concentrate during her shift, and her colleague Nancy asked with concern, "You look pale today. Are you okay?" Mary only replied, "I have some concerns about my daughter," but internally she wanted to talk to Dr. Johnson as soon as possible. After finishing her night shift and returning home, David and Emily were already having breakfast. "Welcome home, Mary. Emily's tooth is feeling much better," David greeted her with a smile. Emily also said, "Good morning, Mom," but her voice was still small and her expression remained stiff. Mary hugged her daughter while continuing to think about the physician's words from the day before. After David left for work, Mary immediately called Dr. Johnson. The receptionist said, "The doctor is seeing patients, but if it's urgent." So Mary said, "This is regarding Emily Harrison, whom you examined yesterday." "I understand the doctor wanted to speak with me." A few minutes later, Dr. Johnson came to the phone. "Mrs. Harrison, thank you for calling. Could you come alone this afternoon? I have something important to discuss about Emily." The physician's voice was serious. Mary suppressed her anxiety and replied, "I understand. Would 2 o'clock be all right?" At 2 p.m., Mary visited Dr. Johnson's dental clinic again. This time she was taken not to an examination room, but to the physician's private office. Dr. Johnson had a serious expression and offered Mary a chair. "When I examined Emily's mouth yesterday, there were several things that concerned me," the physician began. "What kinds of things?" Mary's voice was trembling. Dr. Johnson began his explanation, carefully choosing his words. "First, there were multiple small injuries inside Emily's mouth. These have characteristics different from typical childhood injuries. Also, there are mild issues with her nutritional condition." Mary was surprised and protested, "Malnutrition? But Emily eats her meals properly and gets excellent grades." However, the physician shook his head. Even when a child appears healthy on the surface, chronic stress can have various effects on a child's body. Emily's reaction yesterday was also clearly different from normal dental treatment fear. "What do you mean?" Mary felt her heartbeat quickening. Dr. Johnson, from his years of experience, could recognize the characteristics of abused children. Emily's behavior was clearly different when her father was present versus when he wasn't. Particularly, she was abnormally tense in front of her father. Mary shook her head. "That's not right. David is a wonderful father. He's passionate about Emily's education and has a good reputation as a father in the neighborhood." However, at that moment, deep in Mary's heart, small incidents she had overlooked began to resurface. Emily's night crying, her abnormal fear of David, her no longer playing with friends, her tense expressions during meals. "Mrs. Harrison, I've been treating children for 30 years. Unfortunately, I've seen many children who show reactions like Emily's." Dr. Johnson's voice was gentle but filled with conviction. "Of course, my assumption might be wrong. But if I'm correct, Emily needs help." Mary was confused, torn between her love and trust for her husband and the physician's serious warning. "But I can't imagine David laying a hand on our daughter. Rather, he's very education-focused," she began, when Dr. Johnson quietly spoke. "Abuse isn't only physical violence. Psychological pressure, excessive expectations, and control through fear can also constitute serious abuse for a child." That night, Mary created an opportunity to talk alone with Emily. David had called to say he'd be home late due to a late meeting, so while having dinner with her daughter, Mary carefully approached the subject. "Emily, you seem to have less energy lately. Is there something worrying you?" Emily initially answered, "Nothing," but when Mary gently and persistently talked to her, she finally opened up. "Mom, I'm scared of Dad," she confessed in a small voice. Mary's heart nearly stopped. "Why are you scared? What does Dad do?" Through tears, Emily began to reveal the truth she had never been able to tell anyone. "When I make mistakes in my studies, Dad makes a very scary face. Then he says things like, 'I'm disappointed,' and 'You're stupid.' Sometimes I get locked in my room for long periods, and I don't get meals." Mary held her daughter while trembling. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked, and Emily replied, "Dad said, this is just between us. If you tell Mom, Mom will be sad too." Even more horrifying facts came to light. David had been repeatedly psychologically abusing his daughter. In his pursuit of perfection, whenever she couldn't meet his expectations even slightly, he would severely scold her, thoroughly destroying her self-esteem. He would daily subject her to words like, "You're useless, I thought you were smarter," and "You're a disappointment," controlling Emily through fear. Mary finally understood. Her husband's perfect education had actually been abuse. She had completely failed to understand the difference between love and control. David's eagerness to accompany them to the dental clinic was because he feared Emily might tell the physician something. And Dr. Johnson had seen through this truth. The next day, Mary summoned the courage to consult with Child Protective Services. A specialized counselor listened to her story and said, "We need to take action immediately." Mary decided to take Emily and seek refuge at her parents' home. While packing, Mary deeply felt how blind she had been. Her love and trust for her husband had made her unable to see her daughter's suffering. The neighbors' praise had also been due to David's skillful acting. He had played the ideal father on the surface while psychologically controlling his daughter at home. When David came home that evening, Mary and Emily had already left. Mary left a note explaining that she knew everything, that she had left home to protect Emily, and that she had consulted with appropriate professional agencies. She also called David's parents, the Roberts, to explain their son's behavior. Initially disbelieving, the grandparents finally had to accept the truth after hearing Mary's detailed explanation and Emily's testimony. David repeatedly called Mary's family home, pleading, "It's a misunderstanding, and let's talk about it." However, Mary, following advice from the Child Protective Services counselor, decided not to meet without a professional present. A week later, a family meeting was finally arranged. The meeting included Mary, David, grandparents Robert and Patricia, and Dr. Wilson, a specialist in child psychology. Emily waited in a separate room with a female counselor. David initially insisted, "It's all a misunderstanding, and I love my daughter." However, when Dr. Wilson read Emily's testimony and the results of her psychological evaluation, his expression changed. "Your actions clearly constitute psychological abuse," Dr. Wilson stated calmly. "Perfectionism and love are different things. Control through fear leaves deep wounds in a child's heart." David tried to argue, but faced with concrete evidence and expert explanation, he finally fell silent. Grandfather Robert said to his son in a trembling voice, "David, what you did is the same as what I used to do to you." The former principal admitted that he had been too strict in educating his own son in the same way. "I controlled you under the guise of education. And you did the same thing to Emily." Grandmother Patricia also cried, saying, "Our education was wrong. We've done something inexcusable to our granddaughter." The chain of abuse disguised as perfectionism that had been passed down through 3 generations was finally revealed. David ultimately admitted to his actions and promised to undergo psychological treatment. However, Mary had already decided on divorce. "Because I loved you, I couldn't see my daughter's suffering. But I will never make the same mistake again," she quietly declared. The divorce proceedings lasted 6 months, but Mary obtained custody of Emily. David was allowed monthly visits under professional supervision. The grandparents also agreed to undergo family counseling to reconsider how they interacted with their granddaughter. A year later, David was living alone in a different apartment while continuing psychological treatment. Through discussions with his therapist, he came to deeply understand how the strict education he had received from his father had both tormented him and caused him to torment Emily. He realized that the fear of not being loved unless perfect had controlled his life and had also controlled his daughter's life. Mary and Emily were living a peaceful life in their new apartment. Emily made friends at her new school and began to regain her former brightness. Mother and daughter cooked together, played in the park on weekends, and built a natural parent-child relationship without pressure. Emily sometimes asked, "How is Dad?" but there was no longer any expression of fear. 2 years later in spring, during David's monthly visit with Emily, he finally offered his daughter a heartfelt apology. "Daddy was wrong. I loved you, but I didn't know how to love properly. I'm truly sorry for scaring you and causing you pain." Emily replied, "Dad, I'm not scared anymore," and held her father's hand. It was a small step, but it was a moment filled with hope. Grandparents Robert and Patricia were also reconsidering their educational approach through counseling. During reunions with their granddaughter, instead of asking about grades, they began asking, "Did you have fun today? And did anything interesting happen?" Emily was initially confused but gradually came to enjoy natural conversations with her grandparents. Mary continued her nursing work while also participating in child abuse prevention volunteer activities. She used her experience to support mothers in similar situations. She continued to share the message, love and control are different. True love begins with respecting the child as an individual human being. The Harrison family's story wasn't a complete happy ending. However, it was a story of each person learning what true family love means and beginning to walk new paths in life. David continued his treatment while living with the goal of someday building a normal father-daughter relationship with Emily. And this family's courageous decision became a beacon of hope for many other families suffering in similar ways.